Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights Fall 2020 Lecture Series on Transnational Rights and Security in an Era of Populism. My name is Sahar Aziz, and I'm a law professor and a Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers Law School in Newark, a law school that is nationally known for its commitment to social justice. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And to learn more about the center, you can go to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or follow us on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Today is the first in a series of lectures that will take place over the course of the year. And we are thrilled and honored to be kicking off the lecture series with a brilliant scholar and a friend, Professor KHYATI Joshi, who I will introduce shortly. But before I give the formal introduction, I just want to put in a personal note of praise for Professor Joshi, who has not only written brilliant scholarship, but has been a mentor to many students and many professionals who are committed to diversity and social justice. And she has also done the hard work of training and giving workshops and doing the heavy lifting of training teachers and professionals on the importance of diversity. And right now, with the attacks on diversity and critical race theory and many of the areas in which the center focuses on, it's important that all of us learn for ourselves and read for ourselves and decide for ourselves why critical race theory is so important and why diversity is so important and why racial justice and social justice is so important. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joshi. She is a public intellectual whose social science research and community connections inform policymakers, educators, and everyday people about race, religion, and immigration in 21st century America. She is the author of the book that she will be presenting today, a new book by NYU Press called White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Freedom in America. She is also the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Envisioning Religion, Race, and Asian Americans, and was author and co-editor of Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, one of the most widely used books by diversity practitioners and social justice scholars alike. Dr. Joshi is a professor of education at Farley Dickinson University and a social science researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of race and religion in the United States. She frequently consults with school districts, faith communities, and business on fostering equity and inclusion. She is also well known for creating the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice, which offers multi-day professional development programs for educators since 2007. She has presented her research to scholars around the world and inspired audiences in the United States and abroad. And for that reason, for many reasons, we are so honored to have Dr. Joshi with us today. And I personally am very grateful for her taking the time to educate us about this very important new book that she has just published that can't be more timely at this moment in America's political history. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual stage to Professor Joshi. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully we got that out of the way. Thank you so much for having me as part of the series, and particularly I'm really excited to be kicking off the lecture series with talking about my book. I'm very delighted that you have the center where these topics can be highlighted and focused upon for scholars, for students, for everyday people. I'm going to talk about my book, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. And before I kind of jump into it, I want to talk about why I wrote this book and a couple of things to keep in mind while you're listening to me. You know, if you go on to read the book, or maybe some of you have already read it, and it's also available as an audio book, an ebook. So this book project is both a personal and professional one. And professionally, I saw over the last, decade and a half, or so, more and more work coming out on whiteness in America and the development of whiteness. However, in all of those wonderful resources, one thing was missing, and that was really the explicit role of religion, and examining the explicit role of religion in the development of whiteness. And it's there, and I'm going to talk about that a little today. So that's really my professional reason for writing this book. The personal one is that as a racial and religious minority, I have lived white Christian privilege my whole life. And actually, until graduate school, when I was exposed to the concept of privilege, I didn't have the language to be able to articulate what I was experiencing. And so for me, that is my hope, is that readers of the book, whether you agree or not, whether you like the book or not, have language to be able to talk about these issues, because in our country today, that's what we need. We need to be reading and listening, and then also taking action, which involves discussing things. So that's kind of my hope and why I wrote the book. Now, when I teach about these topics, I keep in mind the head, the heart, and the hand. When writing this book, when teaching, when doing my workshops, or any of the things I engage in around race, religion, social justice. And that is when it's about, we have to have information, right? So that's why y'all are here listening, and you read books and you listen to podcasts and all, so that we can gain information. But there's also the heart piece, right? And the heart piece is not just about caring, though that's what some people think it's about. The heart piece is understanding the affective component of learning. It is understanding the emotional reaction you have to white Christian privilege and the concepts I'll be presenting. So if you find yourself getting angry or bothered or your heart racing, it's important to take notice of that, because those emotions manifest in different ways. They can manifest where you want to know more. They can manifest where you want to check out and leave the room. They can manifest in arguments and being argumentative, for example, in classrooms, which I've certainly faced over the years. But it's not a negative thing. It's important to understand that it's the affective component of learning. And then, of course, there's the hand of the head, heart, and hand. And the hand is about taking action, right? So we are learning, but then we have to do something with the learning. So that's how I approach my work. That's how I've approached this book. Now, when we're talking about white Christian privilege, actually, sometimes I'm talking about white Christian privilege, and sometimes I'm talking about Christian privilege. So I try to be as accurate as possible, understanding that there are both concepts, and we'll get into those in just a second. But think about what we know as what's considered normal when we think about religion, when we think about prayer, and that will get you in the mindset of thinking about white Christian privilege. So I have a few slides I'm going to share along the way to kind of provide you all with some visuals to understand some of the frameworks used. So I will, we're going to start off with this slide. Here is the way I think about Christian privilege and religious oppression and white privilege and racism. Okay, so we have the country, and here are two forms of oppression: racism and religious oppression. And then for our oppressions are a system of advantages and disadvantages based on a particular identity. So if we're talking about, I'm going to actually start over here with racism. Racism is about folks who have white privilege and folks who encounter prejudice, right? People of color. So when we take the parallel concept of religious oppression, the folks who have advantages are folks who have Christian privilege. And historically, we really, to be accurate, really should talk about Protestant Christian, because the United States has a long and drawn out history of anti-Catholicism, and I'll get to that. And the folks who encounter the disadvantages because of the presence of religious oppression are religious minorities, okay? And this oppression, both religious oppression and racism, exists at three levels. They exist at the individual level, which is often where people think bias and discrimination happens. And it certainly does, but that's not the only place, right? There's the societal cultural level. This is the part where of our lives where we have these like social mores and unspoken rules and norms about how one behaves, what's considered normal, what's othered. And then there's the institutional level. And the institutional level is just what it sounds like, where oppression exists in our institutions, government, business, healthcare, and so on, education, okay? So now we can actually hone in and take on specifically the idea of Christian privilege, religious oppression, and the prejudice against religious minorities, right? And here you'll see that I've replaced the three levels with the phrases that I use in the book. So Christian hegemony is really about how all of this manifests at the institutional level. Christian normativity is kind of, you could think of it as business as usual also. And you know what's considered normal. And then Christian privilege is really at the individual level, where Christian folks have advantages, where society has been made for them. And remember, privilege is a product of oppression, right? So Christian privilege is a product of systemic religious oppression over the history of this country. People who have Christian privilege and white Christian privilege didn't do a darn thing to have it, except for to be part of that group, okay? It is the accumulation of advantages over time, over generations. So that's an important piece about understanding privilege. Now, the thing is that when we're talking, I'm gonna stop sharing here for a little bit. When we're talking about the Christian hegemony, when we're talking about the institutional level, we can talk laws, we can talk history. All right, and indeed, Christian privilege is built into the edifice of American law. We have, if we take the First Amendment, some of the free exercise cases that are associated with the First Amendment, we see distinctions between belief and action. Actually, that's a really enduring theme in the free exercise cases. Protestant religious practice typically has been more about beliefs than about taking, you know, like religiously mandated action. So yes, of course, folks go to church and participate in the sacraments, but it's really, really about belief. So I'm gonna actually share, we have three cases of several that I just wanna highlight. There's the Goldman case in 1986 that dealt with the issue of head coverings. There is what we call, often referred to as the peyote case, which was in 1990 when employees were subjected to a drug test and then not hired because they had, the drug test came back positive and they had ingested peyote as part of a ritual. And so it became, it was contested. And then there's the Ling case, which is the issue of land and what's considered sacred and what's not, the idea of the veneration of nature. And what we see in all of these cases is that the courts, in all of these cases, one could argue that the court was upholding an outcome that kind of affects everyone equally, okay? That there should be military uniformity, you know, you can't have different head coverings. Of course, there should be a ban on illegal drugs. And, you know, this idea of recognizing traditions of a particular group associated with nature just didn't really make sense, right? So sometimes the courts will use the phrase facially neutral, and they made decisions that are facially neutral. However, the truth is that Christianity has been the face of facially neutral, okay? Because if Protestant Christian practice included devotional head covering, you know, then Dr. Goldman, who sued, and actually many Sikh soldiers in recent years would not have to fight those fights. Okay, if Protestant Christians used peyote in their religious practice, it would have never been declared an illegal drug in the first place. And if Protestant Christians and Christianity at large recognized the notion of sacred lands and called for spiritually important natural spaces to be undisturbed, like the logging operations in Ling, would have never commenced, right? And it's actually, nature veneration is there in various indigenous rituals. It's there in Hinduism and Buddhism. It's prevalent in many different religious practices. Thus, Christians will never experience a facially neutral ban on their practices, and the burden of government regulation kind of always falls on religious minorities. Now, another place we see, and I'm going to share a screen here, another place where we see a Christian hegemony actually is, we can look at history, right? And so very briefly, just, these are a few events that you can look more into, but there's the doctrine of discovery, which was a set of papal decrees in the 15th century that essentially said if the explorers, we would identify as colonizers, I should say, came upon land that was uninhabited by Christians, then it was theirs to take. Okay. Another example is the Civilization Act of 1819, which provided missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries, with federal funds to civilize, i.e. convert Native American and indigenous peoples. We have several immigration acts, which I'll speak about later, as well as naturalization acts, citizenship laws, where we see the the presence of Christian hegemony. And even in the impact of the executive order of 9066, which is the executive order signed by President Roosevelt interning Japanese and Japanese Americans, we can see how those who were Japanese and Christian were impacted in a slightly different way than those who were not, okay? We also have Christian normativity, okay? That's at the sociocultural level. So what does this mean? Well, consider how folks worship, okay? Place and group practice. What's considered normal? Going to a church once a week. Some religions don't have a weekly worship place, or you don't need that, right? The idea of building a house of worship. So we have freedom of religion in the First Amendment, but that doesn't mean all religious groups have actually been able to practice their faiths freely. We have countless examples across the country of gurudwaras, of masjids, of Hindu temples, of synagogues, facing opposition when communities were trying to construct those houses of worship. We have architectural norms. So church steeples aren't a problem, but minarets sometimes, or tradition, or Hindu temples constructed in South Indian tradition have been, right? What about how we think about the image of God? It's typically the cover of my book, right? The white-haired male God, right? But what about the fact that actually some faiths have no image, and some religious traditions have variety of images, right? What do we think about as the normal way of praying? And there is the normal way, and then other ways are othered, literally. All right. And now we can think about Christian privilege at the individual level. Okay, so a few examples, and then I'll talk about them, is this idea as a Christian, I can run for office and my religion not be brought into question. American English idioms and metaphors incorporate my religion and religious stories for a Christian. As a Christian, I can protest and my patriotism is not questioned. As a Christian, when I swear on an oath on my holy book, my credibility won't be questioned. And as a Christian, I can have my religious event at a venue of my choosing without changing or giving up rituals, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about these. I think we can see the first one I talked about, where I can run for office and my religion not be brought into question. The example I talk about in the book, and we have unfortunately too many examples from present day, is actually Governor Nikki Haley of South Carolina. She grew up sick and she converted to Christianity. Specifically, she identifies as Methodist. And she, when she was running for office in South Carolina, her campaign would receive emails asking if she was a Christian, because then, some emails were like, well, if she's a Christian, she can represent me. If she's not, I'm not sure she can represent me. So eventually her campaign added a tab, Nikki is a Christian, right? So this idea that you're going to have to be Christian and in many cases white to really be able to run for office, you know, because otherwise you're actually, then we can get into the patriotism one. American English idioms and metaphors incorporate my religion and religious stories. There was a time I was in 9th grade in English class. And I didn't do very well in English class in high school. I couldn't connect to anything. And my teacher was teaching us about similes and metaphors. And she said, okay, well, simile and metaphor, okay, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know the story of the Good Samaritan. And she's talking to the class. I didn't know what she was talking about, right? But it was also, I understood that I was supposed to know what this is, and I was not about to raise my hand and say I didn't understand. And so I went through the whole class not really understanding the emphasis, and I really didn't know who to go to talk about. So I don't think I really grasped the concepts of simile and metaphor for a long time, right? So she didn't do that on purpose, but that's how ubiquitous this is, right? And that's an example of Christian privilege in everyday life. So briefly, I do want to touch on how did we get here? Like today, you know, we have white Christian privilege in our country. And let me be clear, some people, sometimes, you know, as I said, I'm talking about white Christian privilege, and sometimes I'm talking about Christian privilege, because we do have Christian communities of color who also have Christian privilege. But then when we really look at, you know, take into account intersectionality and look at our lives, how they work every day, the race element is there, right? And so that's why I think the overarching theme is always white Christian privilege or white Christian supremacy. So how did we get here? Well, we first have to kind of back up, and I'm going to go to screen sharing for a couple more minutes. We have to really think about how religious difference turned into racial difference. The modern concept of race as we know it now emerged out of racial differences, right? We have the expulsion of the Jews and Moors from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. Then we also have to consider British colonialism in South Asia, Africa, and actually Oceania. We have the enslavement of Africans and being brought to the Western Hemisphere. We get the modern concept of race eventually. And then we actually see that in the 1800s, the term free, white, and Christian were used interchangeably. So in the United States, this is really how I see it. We have to take into account Christianity and whiteness when we're thinking about three main concepts in the life of this country: genocide, slavery, and colonialism. And these three concepts have often been discussed. Scholar Andrea Smith talks about them as the pillars of white supremacy, right? What I think needs to be added to her very strong argument is the role Christianity has had in the construction of whiteness. So briefly, we see this when we were talking about Native American, when in terms of genocide. Yes, people know about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which contributes to whiteness, right? It's commonly known as the Trail of Tears. We learn about it in elementary school. We don't get the full history usually. But we also have to think about issues of manifest destiny and, for example, the Civilization Act of 1819, which I described earlier, which have Christian foundations. We have, you know, to the Civilization Act, but also when we think about manifest destiny, you know, taking the land from sea to shining sea because it was ordained by God for the colonizers coming over, right? That's built on the doctrine of discovery. So we have to be able to see the Christian roots that have contributed also to genocide of Native Americans. When we're talking about African American, with whiteness, we can see, you know, the idea that African Americans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Of course, the issue of slavery, and then subsequently Jim Crow laws and the issues that continue to happen today against African Americans. We have to also take into account the biblical justification for slavery and see the role that it played. And there's, you know, many things written about the role of racism in Christianity and the subjugation of African Americans. Then we have to consider Asian American and Hispanic folks and thinking about colonialism, right? So we can think about immigration policy and citizenship, but we have to also consider the role of Christianity because we see the social and legal exclusion of non-Protestants, okay? Specifically, you know, though we have a long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism, although while folks encountered that form of discrimination, they were legally accepted as white and could be citizens, which was not the case for those coming from Asia and present day Middle East. And of course, there's a long lot of case law showing how folks became white and petitioned the courts and sued the courts to be considered white so that they could gain citizenship. Now, I'm not going to go into other history here. If I had time and if it's relevant during the Q&A, I would certainly talk about specifically a few immigration laws that really show how our country was socially engineered through immigration policy to be white and to be Protestant. But I do want to offer a path forward, right? A path towards justice, because this book for me is about taking action. So I actually I'll go back to this. In terms of building a more perfect union, I talk about a blueprint of 5 things to change: changing the language, changing the questions, changing the focus, changing the paradigm, and changing our foundational assumptions. So I'm just gonna hit on a couple of these. So changing the question. This can go in a couple of different ways. On a very individual level, on the micro level, you know, instead of asking folks, well, what's your Christmas? Which, let me tell you, I can't count the number of times I've been asked, what's my Christmas or what's my Bible? You know, can we consider the fact that, you know, well, what's the most significant religious celebration for you? You know, granted, I know that takes up more words and we're often looking for the shortest way of doing everything, but that's not going to always work, right? Or, you know, what are sacred scriptures what religious sacred scriptures are holy for you, or something like that, right? So we have to reframe our questions. But then there are more meta questions. The more meta questions that I want to see changed are, you know, right now, the moral questions of America get defined by what is important to conservative Christians. So the moral questions of America are usually, the discussions are around abortion, around marriage equality or same-sex marriage, and topics like that. But who got to define those questions? Conservative Christians, right? I think a moral question is environmental justice. Like, what are we doing about environmental justice? So we have to kind of take a stand and reframe questions, moral questions in our country that work for the larger majority, right? I want to say change the paradigm. Change the paradigm here is that often we think about like in interfaith movements, you know, how are we all similar? And that's not going to cut it. We really need to be thinking about how we are different, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. So we're going to have to focus on difference, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing, though it's often been seen as a negative thing. But we're going to have to see that all religious groups are not on equal footing in this country. And so if you're having inter-religious dialogue and interfaith actions, you have to take into account Christian privilege and white Christian privilege. And finally, I'll end with change foundational assumptions. And one example I can give you of that is that I am a proponent of saying Merry Christmas during the holidays. I think it's really important. I know that as a Hindu, I love to hear Happy Diwali. Sometimes not only do people not say it, I don't even get a Happy Holidays. But Happy Holidays, I understand for those who are Christian why it feels diluted, why it feels like their religion is being done away with. And I'm all in favor of saying Merry Christmas, right? With saying that, I also then think we have to be able to wish people a happy Diwali, a Hag Sameach for Passover, you know, Eid Mubarak. We have to know those things. We have to have religious literacy, okay? So I'm gonna, Professor Aziz, stop with that. And I'm sure you and others have many questions, and we can get to some answers perhaps.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. That was so informative. And I know there's a lot more there because I'm almost done reading your book. I think I have one chapter left and it's mesmerizing. And for those, there are people in the audience who we've both worked with. So the fact that you're doing race and religion is extremely exciting for me because I do similar work with a particular focus on Muslims. Now, as you know, the Center for Security, Race and Rights focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, which is a very large, diverse group of people religiously, racially, ethnically, from an immigration standpoint, etc. So I'm particularly grateful that you're bringing these issues into account. I'll start the Q&A, and I should tell everyone in the audience that there is a Q&A function, so please feel free to ask your questions. And I'm going to start it off with a question because I think you're just so well positioned to answer both as an expert, but also in your own positionality, right, in society, your personal experiences, which is how does the racialization of religion in the United States affect South Asians? And South Asians, as you know more than I do, are extremely diverse in both religious tradition and also ethnicity and language and immigration experiences. But could you give us a little bit of insight about that particular ethnic and racial group, especially in contemporary, historically and contemporarily?
Yeah. Well, racialization of religion in terms of South Asians, we have to take into account a few things. So first of all, what is racialization of religion, right? And it's really when particular religions become associated with physical characteristics. Now, it's also kind of situated in the current historical cultural context, so that we can't just look at it in a vacuum, right? So in the 60s, perhaps folks who were from South Asia or appeared to be from South Asia, had brown skin, had certain features, might have been associated with Hinduism and being a hippie and those kind of things. Since the Iran hostage crisis and the oil issues of the 1970s, and subsequently because of 9/11, really the racialization of religion, it works differently. And most people with who look like me, have brown skin, dark hair, especially men, they are affected in a different way. It's certainly gendered, become associated with Muslim. So it's this idea of anyone is brown equals Muslim equals terrorist, right? And someone who should be feared. So that's one way racialization of religion really works. But another important piece to keep in mind is that because of the racialization of religion, the religious dimension of the discrimination, of the marginalization, often gets hidden and you just can't see it. So the emphasis becomes on race, but we have to be able to see how that is marginalizing people's religious identities, because and sometimes when the discrimination is happening, you can't separate. But for the individual, when a Sikh man is attacked and he wears a turban, he is not just being attacked because of how he appears. For him, it is also an attack on his faith. And that is an important element to remember that often goes under the radar. You're muted. Sahar, you're muted.
We have some questions from the audience. Please, the audience should feel free to ask questions. I'm going to stop recording. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. We need much more time. I wish we could have hosted you in person, but COVID-19 is in the way. But as we say, inshallah, next year we will all be meeting in person. I've learned a tremendous amount. I know we had a lot of students from Rutgers University Law School in Newark and from other places. We had professors, we had lawyers. So we're very fortunate to have you. And I always end by allowing the speaker to just give some final remarks. But before I do, I just want to put in a plug for the Center for Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers University Law School in Newark, We are the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, and we do it through a transnational and cross-racial and interfaith approach. And we have 3 more lectures this semester on September 23rd. We have Dr. Amy Austin Holmes, who will be presenting her book on revolutions and coups and revolutions, mass mobilization, the Egyptian military, and the US from Mubarak to Sisi. On October 5th, we have Azadeh Shahshahani, who will be talking about from sanctions to the Muslim ban, transnational impacts of Iranian Americans. And on October 28th, we will have Abukar Arman, who will talk about how the relationship between counterterrorism, anti-Muslim racism against Somalians in the US, and foreign policy in Somalia. So we've got a great lineup for the semester, but we are so fortunate to have started the series with Dr. Joshi. This was perfect. This was exactly what we needed to hear in light of the coming elections and what's going on in the everything that's being discussed in the news. So I'll give you the floor to just end the remarks and give us your wise words of advice.
Okay, well, the first thing I want to do is share this slide so that folks can connect with me on social media. So folks can get a screenshot or whatever. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. I also really want to say thanks for inviting me, but thank you for all that you do for having the center, because I know it's not easy. This work, for all of us who engage in it, there's that affective component, there's that emotional piece, whether it's because we're affected personally or somebody starts arguing about these issues or asking you, why are you having a certain lecture as part of your series? And so that takes a toll on folks. And I really want to say thanks very much, Sahar, for having me. And I do look forward to visiting the center someday in person. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right.